The 14th rule of a meaningful life establishes a principle about decision-making and understanding: judgment, the capacity to discern what actually matters, to distinguish signal from noise, to understand nuance and complexity, to make sound decisions despite uncertainty, is rarer and more valuable than raw intelligence or knowledge. The person with excellent judgment often accomplishes far more than the person with greater intelligence but poor judgment. Judgment is not innate. It's developed through experience, through reflection on experience, through learning from mistakes, and through genuine engagement with complexity. This rule recognizes that intelligence alone is insufficient. The intelligent person with poor judgment often makes catastrophic decisions. A person of modest intelligence with excellent judgment often makes sound decisions. Intelligence tells you what's possible. Judgment tells you what's wise. Judgment involves understanding not just technical details but human nature, psychology, consequences, and the complex interconnections between decisions and outcomes. The principle operates through understanding that judgment develops through grappling with real complexity over time. The person who has only read about difficult decisions has less judgment than the person who has actually made difficult decisions, reflected on them, and learned from them. The person who has experienced consequences of decisions has better judgment than the person who has only theorized about decisions. The mechanism also involves understanding that good judgment requires humility, recognition that you don't understand everything, that situations are more complex than they appear, that unintended consequences are likely. The person certain they fully understand a situation often has worse judgment than the person uncertain but thoughtful. Certainty often indicates insufficient understanding of complexity. The rule also recognizes that judgment involves understanding people and psychology deeply. The person who understands how people actually behave, what actually motivates them, how they actually respond to circumstances, develops better judgment than the person who believes people operate according to logical principles. Real judgment involves understanding people's irrationality, their self-deception, their conflicting motivations. The rule also recognizes that judgment improves with age if you're paying attention. The person who reflects on experience, who examines their mistakes, who learns from what happens develops better judgment over time. The person who repeats the same mistakes, who doesn't reflect on experience, doesn't develop better judgment despite aging. Successfully implementing this rule requires understanding what constitutes good judgment and how it develops. The first component is distinguishing between what matters and what merely appears urgent. The urgency often isn't important. The truly important often isn't urgent. The person with good judgment can make this distinction. The person with poor judgment often pursues what merely appears urgent while neglecting what actually matters. The second component is understanding systems and how things interconnect. A decision affects not just the immediate situation but connected situations. The person with good judgment understands these interconnections. They recognize that changing one thing affects other things. This systems thinking prevents unintended negative consequences. The third component is understanding human nature and psychology. People are not purely rational. People rationalize their behavior. People are influenced by emotions, by social pressure, by identity. The person with good judgment understands these psychological realities. The person with poor judgment believes people operate according to logic alone. The fourth component is having seen patterns across multiple situations and understanding how they work. The person with experience across many domains recognizes similar patterns in different contexts. This pattern recognition helps them predict consequences. The person with limited experience hasn't seen enough patterns to recognize them. The fifth component is understanding your own biases and limitations. Good judgment involves recognizing where you're likely to be wrong, what you don't understand, where you lack expertise. The person acknowledging their limitations often has better judgment than the person overconfident in their understanding. The sixth component is thinking through consequences before making decisions. The person with good judgment doesn't just consider immediate effects but thinks through what might happen next, what unintended consequences might occur, what second and third order effects might emerge. This forward thinking prevents many problems. The seventh component is learning from experience. The person who reflects on decisions, what worked, what didn't, what surprised them, what they'd do differently, develops better judgment from experience. The person who makes the same decisions repeatedly without learning doesn't improve. The eighth component is seeking counsel from people with good judgment. The person alone in their decision-making has access only to their own understanding. The person who seeks input from people with different experiences and perspectives develops better judgment. Wise people seek counsel from others. Throughout history, figures whose judgment proved sound often accomplished far more than those with poor judgment. One striking example comes from Winston Churchill. Churchill had to make numerous decisions during World War II with incomplete information and high stakes. Many of his decisions proved sound not because they were obvious but because his judgment, developed through decades of experience and reflection, allowed him to discern what mattered and what approach was wise. Similarly, business leaders who built lasting successful companies often had excellent judgment. They could discern which opportunities were worth pursuing and which were distractions. They could judge people, which people to trust, which to be cautious with. They could predict how markets and people would respond to decisions. This judgment, developed over time, was crucial to their success. In personal contexts, people with excellent judgment often navigate relationships better, make better financial decisions, and avoid costly mistakes. The person who has developed judgment through experience often avoids the mistakes that others repeatedly make. Conversely, figures with poor judgment often made catastrophic errors despite intelligence. The intelligent person who misjudged situations, who failed to understand psychology, who didn't think through consequences often caused tremendous harm despite their capabilities. In organizations, leaders with poor judgment, despite other capabilities, often damage organizations. The leader who doesn't understand people, who makes decisions without thinking through consequences, who has poor intuition about what matters often leads organizations poorly. The leader with sound judgment, even if less brilliant analytically, often leads more effectively. In contemporary professional environments, employees with sound judgment often advance faster and further than those with greater technical skill but poor judgment. The person who understands what their boss actually cares about, who knows which battles to fight and which to let go, who can predict how decisions will be received, develops better working relationships and more success. In financial decision-making, people with sound judgment about money often build better financial situations than those with greater income but poor judgment. The person who understands that certain purchases will regret them, who can resist social pressure to spend, who can see through financial schemes, develops better financial outcomes. In relationship contexts, people with good judgment about people often build stronger relationships. They can discern who's trustworthy and who isn't. They can understand what people need. They can communicate effectively. They have better judgment about when to compromise and when to hold firm. In career choices, people with sound judgment about their own capabilities and what work they actually find fulfilling often build more satisfying careers than people making career choices based on prestige or money. The person who judges accurately what they actually want often chooses better careers than the person pursuing external metrics. In business and leadership, executives with sound judgment often build more successful organizations. They judge which opportunities to pursue, which people to hire and trust, how to navigate complex situations. This judgment, developed over time, creates better organizations. In learning and skill development, people with good judgment about what's worth learning often develop better capabilities than those trying to learn everything. The person who judges which skills are actually valuable in their context, which knowledge actually matters, develops more useful capability. In major life decisions, marriage, where to live, how to raise children, career transitions, people with sound judgment often make better decisions. They consider factors others miss. They predict consequences others don't foresee. They understand people and situations better. Understanding how judgment actually develops helps implement this rule. The first way judgment develops is through experience with real consequences. The person who has made decisions and lived with consequences learns from those consequences. They develop intuition about what works and what doesn't. The second way is through deliberate reflection on experience. The person who makes decisions and then doesn't reflect on them doesn't develop much judgment. The person who examines decisions, what worked, what didn't, why, what surprised them, develops judgment from experience. The third way is through exposure to diverse situations. The person who has experienced many different contexts, many different types of people, many different types of problems develops better pattern recognition than the person with limited experience. The fourth way is through mentorship and learning from others' experience. You can learn from others' mistakes without making them all yourself. The person who learns from people with good judgment develops judgment faster than the person learning only through their own mistakes. The fifth way is through studying history and examining how situations and decisions played out. The person who studies history understands patterns that repeat across time. They develop judgment about human nature and how situations evolve. The sixth way is through genuine humility and recognition of what you don't understand. The person willing to say, "I don't know," and to learn develops better judgment than the person certain they understand everything. The seventh way is through practice making decisions in low-stakes situations, reflecting, learning, and gradually tackling higher-stakes situations. The person building judgment gradually, learning from smaller decisions before making larger ones, often develops better judgment than the person jumping into high-stakes decisions without preparation. The primary challenge in implementing this rule is that judgment development takes time. You cannot accelerate judgment development significantly. You can learn from others' experience, but you must also develop your own experience. The person wanting judgment to develop quickly is disappointed. The challenge also involves learning from painful mistakes. Some of the most valuable judgment-developing experiences are mistakes that caused significant consequences. The person unwilling to examine their mistakes, unwilling to accept responsibility for them, doesn't develop judgment from them. The person who does develops valuable judgment. The challenge also involves the difficulty of recognizing when your judgment is poor. The person with poor judgment often doesn't recognize it. They think they're judging well. This blind spot prevents learning. Developing judgment requires being open to feedback that your judgment wasn't as sound as you thought. The challenge also involves the humility required to seek counsel. The person who thinks they can judge everything alone often has worse judgment than the person who seeks input from others. But seeking counsel requires admitting you might not have all the answers. The challenge also involves the complexity of modern situations. Many modern situations are genuinely complex with many interconnections, many stakeholders, many possible consequences. Developing judgment about truly complex situations is harder than developing judgment about simpler situations. Rule 14 might seem to advocate such uncertainty that you cannot act decisively. The resolution is understanding that sound judgment includes confidence in your decision-making process while humility about your understanding of everything. You can be confident that you're thinking through a decision well while being humble that you might still be missing something. With Rule 6 about responsibility, developing judgment means taking responsibility for decisions while recognizing that outcomes depend partly on factors you don't control. With Rule 8 about process, judgment involves developing sound decision-making processes. With Rule 10 about resilience, judgment involves understanding that even sound decisions sometimes produce unexpected consequences and maintaining resilience through that. The sophisticated approach involves developing your judgment through experience and reflection, seeking counsel from others, studying how situations and decisions play out, maintaining humility about your understanding, and making sound decisions while accepting that perfect knowledge is impossible. Rule 14 establishes that judgment, the capacity to discern what actually matters, to understand nuance and complexity, to make sound decisions despite uncertainty, is rarer and more valuable than raw intelligence. The person with excellent judgment often accomplishes far more than the person with greater intelligence but poor judgment. Master this rule by distinguishing what matters from what merely appears urgent, by understanding systems and how things interconnect, by understanding human nature and psychology, by recognizing patterns from experience, by understanding your own biases and limitations, by thinking through consequences before deciding, by learning from experience, and by seeking counsel from people with sound judgment. The 14th rule of life, then, is really a rule about wisdom and sound decision-making. Those who master it understand that judgment develops through experience and reflection, that humility about your understanding improves judgment, and that the person with sound judgment navigates life far more successfully than the person with greater intelligence but poor judgment. Develop your judgment through experience and reflection, cultivate humility about your understanding, and you'll discover that sound judgment becomes one of your most valuable capabilities.